Alison's already introduced us to the idea of Cleopatra as being fundamental to Augustus's story. And I thought, because I'm an Egyptologist, I thought it would be much interesting to me and possibly to you, I hope, to explore her story a bit more, because her story is one that is very much preserved through Augustus's propaganda. And I believe that he deliberately selected her to be his enemy to allow him to remove Mark Antony, the threat posed by Mark Antony, and so develop himself into the Emperor Augustus. To start sort of at the beginning of her dynasty, Cleopatra is not part of the very long, almost 3,000 years of dynastic rulers of Egypt. She is of Macedonian extraction, and her period really starts when Alexander the Great invades Egypt in 332 BCE. He dies soon after, and there's a little bit of a hiatus, and then the Ptolemies come to the throne, and this is the dynasty that Cleopatra belongs to. She is a Ptolemy. Ptolemy I, who we see here, is actually a general of Alexander, and when Alexander's empire is broken up, he gets Egypt, which is, I think, was probably the best thing to get, definitely the best thing to get. I've got two images of him here. You can see him both as a classical Hellenistic type person, and you can see him as a typical Egyptian pharaoh, because every time foreigners ruled Egypt, within Egypt themselves, they depicted themselves as typically Egyptian, wearing typical Egyptian regalia and doing the same gestures and rituals that a normal Egyptian pharaoh would do. So we see throughout this period, throughout the dynasty of the Ptolemies, we will see these people in two very different ways. One thing that Ptolemy I does is that he actually kidnaps the body of Alexander and takes it to Egypt. And this in a way gives him a validity for his reign, that he now has this body of Alexander under his control. The other thing that he does that is really important to our story is that he develops Alexandria as a capital city. And Alexandria is the city where Cleopatra will live out most of her life, and it's the city that, that plays a big role in her story. So here we have it. On the left, you can see a map of Egypt. Traditionally, Egypt would be ruled from either Memphis in the north or Thebes in the south. I've put a massive circle actually on Alexandria. It is not that big, but I just wanted you to be able to see it. You can see it's a coastal city, so it interfaces with the Mediterranean world as well as interfacing with Africa. So it's a different kind of capital city, and it's very much a modern contemporary city. We have reports of people who visited ancient Alexandria, and they see it as a wonderful place. It's a place of festivals and celebrations. It's got a fantastic lighthouse. It's got a museum. It's got a library. It's a place of learning and culture and celebration. It's very different to the rest of Egypt, to the extent that the Egyptians don't really regard Alexandria, even though it is technically their capital city, as a part of Egypt. And here I've just put up an image of, well, it's not an image of the lighthouse because we don't really know what the lighthouse looked like, but a reconstruction of the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, which is now lost. So Cleopatra lives in this vibrant city. Here's a plan of it just to show you how modern it is. Normal Egyptian cities just a little higgledy-piggledy. They grow up over time. Buildings are knocked down, they're replaced. We don't have straight streets like this. In Alexandria, we have a proper grid network. You could have an address in Alexandria, which would be very difficult in any of Egypt's other cities. The problem is, though, the Ptolemies lived here, the Ptolemies died here, but there's not much left for the archaeologists to find. I think you can see from this image here of an archaeological site in the centre of Alexandria just how built up it is. And this is one of very, very few archaeological sites. We have this, and we have some catacombs, but that's basically it. Very, very little survives of Cleopatra's Alexandria. If we look here over the harbour, we can see again built up right up to the edge of the harbour to the water, and the water's edge actually disappeared in antiquity. There was an earthquake and that was vanished. And unfortunately, where the cars are now and moving out into the water is the area where the royal palace would have been. So we've lost almost everything to do with Cleopatra from her home city. Here we have looking over the other form of the harbour, and we can see where the lighthouse would have been. There's a modern fort there today, but it's not there. This means that a lot of the evidence that we have from Alexandria is coming from underwater. It's underwater archaeology, and this is fantastic stuff, but it's progressing not necessarily very, very slowly. And the material that's being salvaged from underwater, I think you can see that in this image here, is quite badly damaged. It's quite badly worn. But one thing that is becoming apparent is that the Ptolemies decorated their capital city, Alexandria, with artifacts that they'd taken from other parts of Egypt. So not only are we managing to find Ptolemaic statues and artifacts under the waters of Alexandria, we're finding much older artifacts as well. So Alexandria was almost itself like a living museum. So if we get to Cleopatra the Seventh, who was she? Well, we know who her father was. He was this man here. He was Ptolemy the 12th. It's very confusing, this family, because all the blokes are called Ptolemy in one version or another, and nearly all the women are called Cleopatra, Arsinoe, or Berenike. This is Ptolemy the 12th, who also regarded himself as a form of the god Dionysus, and he ruled Egypt with a little break in the middle of his rule. We don't know who Cleopatra's mother was. We call her Cleopatra the Fifth. Yes, that probably is her name, but we're not absolutely certain. And because we don't know who her mother was, it's difficult to trace her ancestry through the female line, obviously. We do, however, know that she had at least two sisters, Berenike IV and Arsinoe IV, and she had two brothers, Ptolemy the 13th and Ptolemy the 14th. Another sister, Cleopatra the Sixth, may not have existed. In fact, we kind of suspect that she didn't exist, but she's been numbered. And because it would mess up the numbering system and all the published books would be completely wrong, we tend to keep our Cleopatra as Cleopatra the Seventh, missing out Cleopatra the Sixth. So it goes from Cleopatra the Fifth, the mother, or the possible mother, to Cleopatra the Seventh. And we just forget the fact that there is possibly no Cleopatra the Sixth. You can see from what I put here that all these siblings ruled Egypt. In fact, Berenike ruled Egypt at the same time, or in the middle of the reign of her father. So it's quite an ambitious family. The one survivor, the one who outlasted the rest of them and ruled Egypt for a long time, was our Cleopatra, Cleopatra the Seventh. Here, I've given her a basic history. She was born in approximately 70 BCE. We can't be absolutely certain of this, but we do know when she died. And we know that she was about 39 years of age when she died, so we can work it backwards. That's how we do it. She came to the throne in 51 BCE after her father died, but she didn't come to the throne alone. It's one of the things that we forget about Cleopatra. She never ruled Egypt alone. She came to the throne with her much younger brother, Ptolemy the 13th. And it's possible that they were married, because marriage between brother-sisters in the Ptolemaic royal family was a fairly standard thing. The problem was she was about 18 years of age and he was about 10 years of age. He was still very much influenced by his tutors and by his guardians, whereas she was quite independent. The two of them didn't really work well together, and they started to quarrel. By the time he was old enough really to assert his authority, their relationship had completely broken down, and Egypt was actually on the verge of civil war. I think the story of how Ptolemy the 13th kills Pompey the Great as a gift to Julius Caesar is probably well known. That's obviously an unfortunate episode. The result of that was Julius Caesar came to Alexandria and decided that he would sort out the problems in Egypt between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy. And Caesar is quite interested in events in Egypt because Egypt is a rich and fertile land. He wants Egypt to flourish. He feels that he's got an investment in Egypt. He's almost poised to take over at any time, but he would like Egypt to develop. He would like to be on friendly terms with Egypt because he would like to be able to exploit her resources. So the civil war ends with Julius Caesar supporting Cleopatra. There's a famous story about how she actually met Julius Caesar for the first time in Alexandria, that she couldn't get to the palace because it was under siege, and she was brought into the palace, rolled up in a carpet and unrolled at his feet, and Cleopatra and Caesar immediately fell in love. That's probably an exaggeration. That's probably not what happened. But what did happen is that she persuaded Caesar that she was a better potential ruler than her brother. The war happened. Her husband, brother Ptolemy the 13th, was killed, and she ended up ruling Egypt with her younger still brother, Ptolemy the 14th, by her side, under the protection of Julius Caesar. And from Cleopatra's point of view, this was a really, really good idea, because she presumably thought that Julius Caesar was going to go on for many, many years and would be able to protect her. She gave birth to a son who she named Caesarion. She never said who Caesarion's father was, but there was a lot of gossip in Rome, in Egypt. Most people assumed that he was the son of Julius Caesar. And again, this was a very astute move, because if he was the son of Caesar, it was very likely that Caesar would then protect his son and protect his son's interests in Egypt. So Cleopatra's decision to side with Julius Caesar and to bear a child by Julius Caesar was a sensible political decision, but unfortunately it went wrong, because Julius Caesar was assassinated, something that clearly Cleopatra couldn't have foreseen. She was in Rome when Caesar was assassinated. She returned fairly quickly to Egypt with her son and her husband brother, and soon after Ptolemy the 14th died. This left Cleopatra clear to rule Egypt by herself with her baby son Caesarion. Effectively, she was the sole ruler of Egypt, because the baby Caesarion wasn't really going to be able to do much ruling for many, many years. And about this time, Cleopatra promoted herself as the living representation of the goddess Isis. I'll just end this slide by pointing out that I have an image of Julius Caesar here. So Cleopatra, she's had already quite an exciting life up to this point. There's been a civil war. She's been married twice. Both her husbands have died. She's had an affair with Julius Caesar. We think she's born a child. She's associating herself in a very real way with the goddess Isis. She is the living representative of this goddess, and she is worshipped as a goddess. Here we have the Egyptian goddess Isis, and we can tell it's Isis because of the crown that she wears. That is a throne. It's a representation of Egyptian throne, because the name Iset, Isis, means throne. This goddess has a very long and complicated mythology in ancient Egypt. She goes right the way back to the Pyramid Age. Basically, she's most famous for being the mother and the protector of the king of Egypt. And so this makes her a very suitable person for Cleopatra to be associated with, because Cleopatra too has a king of Egypt as a child. Isis also absorbs mythology and regalia from other goddesses in Egypt. So at the beginning of the dynastic age, Egypt has many goddesses. By the end of it, it has far fewer goddesses, and Isis has kind of absorbed all their cults. This is what Isis would have looked like to Cleopatra. It's very different. She wears a dress and a mantle or shawl, which is knotted in a classical Isis knot. She shakes a sistrum, which is this musical instrument here that you can see. It would have had little discs on it, and if you shake it, it would have made a percussion sound. She has a crown on her head. She also, at this stage, is absorbing the attributes of Greek goddesses to classical goddesses. So Demeter, Athena, Hera, Artemis, Aphrodite. Isis is a really important person. The fact that Cleopatra considers herself to be the living Isis is an important matter. Isis is being worshipped in Rome at this time, so it also gives Cleopatra some sort of sway if she wanted to try and push it further within Rome as well. In Alexandria, she's really important. Isis is the queen of heaven, and she's the mistress of the sea. She protects the harbour. She heals in the temple hospitals which are outside the city walls. And she's the queen, the consort of the gods Osiris, Dionysus, and Serapis. So a very important person. So going back to Cleopatra's basic history. After the death of Julius Caesar, Cleopatra thinks for a bit. She needs protection. She's there with her young son Caesarion. She's ruling Egypt, but Rome is growing stronger. She decides she needs to team up with somebody. And basically she has a choice of two people. She could either team up with Octavian or with Mark Antony. And the person she chooses is Mark Antony, which at the time I think is a very sensible decision, because he's older, he's more experienced. I think if you had to back anybody, you probably would back Mark Antony. Octavian was known to be weak, less experienced, quite sickly. She thinks she's doing exactly the same, I think, that she did with Julius Caesar. And the two of them team up together. Cleopatra is able to fund Mark Antony's military ambitions. Octavian, however, the partner of Mark Antony, is not particularly impressed by this. It's not something he wants to see happening, because he sees the team of Cleopatra and Mark Antony as a threat. And it becomes very apparent that they're a threat in 34 BCE, when Antony makes a public announcement and announces his plan basically for an Eastern Empire, which will be ruled by his Egyptian family. So Caesarion will be confirmed as both king of Egypt and the heir to Rome. He'll be confirmed as Julius Caesar's son. Cleopatra will be the queen of Egypt. And the three children that Cleopatra has born for Mark Antony will each have lands as well. And Octavian, watching from Rome, is not at all impressed by this. This is a major threat to his ambitions. He doesn't want to fight Mark Antony, however, or he'd prefer not to, I think, because it's much better for a Roman not to fight a Roman. But what he can do is fight Cleopatra, and he can gamble on the fact, I think quite reasonably, that if he declares war on Cleopatra, Mark Antony will support his queen. And so this is essentially what happened. Octavian declares war on Cleopatra, and Mark Antony sides with Cleopatra. There's a massive propaganda war at this time. I think Alice has made it clear how important propaganda is at this time. I just got one extract here from Cassius Dio telling us that Antony posed with Cleopatra for portrait paintings and statues, he representing the god Osiris or Dionysus, and she Selene or Isis. This more than all else made him seem to have been bewitched by her through some enchantment. For she so charmed and enthralled not only him, but also the rest who had any influence with him, that she conceived the hope of ruling even the Romans. And whenever she used on oath to her strongest phrase in swearing was by her purpose to dispense justice on the capital. So here we're being told by Cassius Dio, who is certainly not an eyewitness, he's writing after the events, that Mark Antony was totally under the thumb of Cleopatra, and we find this information from other people too. There are all sorts of rumours that Cleopatra is making Mark Antony, for example, rub her feet at a banquet just as if he was a slave, and that Mark Antony is getting ideas above his station and he wants to sit on a gold throne and so on. All this propaganda is aimed at undermining Mark Antony and undermining Cleopatra, and that the substance of it is that she is an unnaturally strong woman and that he is a very weak man who is being misled, beguiled by this foreign woman. Alison has already mentioned the Battle of Actium, and here we have Actium itself. 31 BCE, there's a battle. Octavian will regard this as a great victory. It's not actually a brilliantly great victory. Basically what happens is that Cleopatra and Mark Antony run away. They've put sails on their boats, and when things aren't going well for them, they flee, ending up in Egypt, and they attempt to regroup, but it's too late. The troops that they're left behind on the ground all defect to Octavian. They've lost their fleet. It's the beginning of the end for both Cleopatra and Antony, and for Egypt itself. Maybe, I think, had they fought in Italy rather than fighting in Greece or off the coast of Greece, it might have gone differently. But again, there's this feeling that you don't want to fight Italians or Italians, Romans. You want to keep the battle slightly away from your homeland. But anyway, it wasn't a good move for Cleopatra and Antony. And not long after, the inevitable happened. They arrived in Egypt, they were followed by Octavian. Egypt was invaded, and with Mark Antony unable to defend himself, first of all, he committed suicide. And then on the 12th of August, 30 BCE, Cleopatra herself committed suicide. And here we have a rather imaginative reconstruction of her death. It's said that she was killed by snake bite, but actually, we're not sure about this. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Antony, writes about it, and he said, "It's said that the asp was brought in with figs and leaves and lay hidden beneath them, for thus Cleopatra had given orders that the reptile might fasten itself on her body without her being aware of it. But the truth of the matter no one knows, for it was also said that she carried about poison in a hollow comb, and kept the comb hidden in her hair. So we don't actually know how Cleopatra died, and no snake was found near the body to substantiate the idea it's a snake. But the idea of snakes in Egyptian royalty is a very alluring one, because everybody knew that Egyptian kings wore a snake on the brow, a uraeus, a rearing snake. So the idea of connecting snakes to royalty was a good one. And also the goddess Isis, who Cleopatra was strongly associated with, could also take the form of a snake. So from this time on, really, it was assumed that Cleopatra had died by snake bite, even though we don't know that this is really what happened. Octavian now took control of Egypt. He wanted to tell the story of Cleopatra because her story is a fundamental part of his, as Alison has demonstrated, and so it had to survive. Obviously, it's not brilliant to defeat a woman in battle. It's much better to defeat a strong man. But he was able to spin the story so that Cleopatra comes out as a sort of very frightening stereotype, the sort of person that the Romans are frightened of, a very strong, unnatural woman. And he uses the story to explain the behaviour of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who had both had an affair with Cleopatra. She is so devious, she is so strong, so unnatural, that she's actually able to lure these two decent men away from their Roman families and try and persuade them to do what she wants. This is useful to Octavian because he wants to be remembered as fighting for Rome, for strong masculine Rome, rather than fighting his fellow Romans. He wants to be remembered for fighting off foreigners who have strange Eastern ways. So a lot of what we know about Cleopatra's story comes from the Roman version, principally told by Plutarch and Cassius Dio. And again, if you look at the dates that I've given here, they are not eyewitnesses, they are writing much later. But just to give one example, Cassius Dio tells us that Cleopatra was of insatiable passion and avarice. By love, she gained the title Queen of the Egyptians. By that he means love for Julius Caesar, who made her Queen of the Egyptians. And when she hoped by the same means to win also that of Queen of the Romans, i.e. with Mark Antony, she failed at this and lost the other beside. She captivated the two greatest Romans of her day, and because of the third, she destroyed herself. We have to remember, however, this is propaganda, and there's at least one other alternative version of this story preserved, and this is in the writings of the Arabic writers. They consider Cleopatra to have been a wise woman. They don't constantly reflect on her association with men and her beauty. They reflect on the fact that she was a sage, a philosopher, who elevated the ranks of scholars and enjoyed their company. She also wrote books on medicine, charms and cosmetics, in addition to many other books ascribed to her, which are known to those who practice medicine. Finally, I just want to consider, what did she actually look like? Because we've talked about her deeds very, very quickly. I would urge you to read up the story of Cleopatra if you don't know it, because it is an absolutely fascinating story. Well, if we look at her coins, we can see that she wasn't what we today would consider to be perhaps a great beauty, but this might be deliberate. It might be that she's giving herself quite a fierce, almost masculine appearance to impress people. She doesn't necessarily want to look small, insignificant, weak, feminine on her coins. And we find that Cleopatra, either the second or the third, takes the same viewpoint. And in her sculpture, she also has this kind of quite aggressive, masculine appearance. We have some images, but not very many at all, of Cleopatra in the classical Hellenistic style. For example, this one here, although unfortunately the nose is missing. And we have one example which seems to show her as a man, but this is wrong. If we look at this picture here from Egypt, on the left we can see the goddess Isis holding the baby god Horus, and on the right we can see the king of Egypt, who the writing underneath, I think if you can see on the second line on the right hand image, says Cleopatra. Originally, it was thought that Cleopatra might have dressed up as a man to rule Egypt. We don't think this is true anymore. We think this is something that was carved for her father during her father's reign, and that when he died and she took the throne, they just changed the name and forgot to change the image on the top. So I don't think we need to assume that Cleopatra dressed as a man to rule Egypt. And in fact, here we have her in a very typical Egyptian scene. She's on the left, and she appears as a very typical Egyptian queen, wearing an Egyptian linen dress and a very elaborate crown. We also have statues of her here. One way that we distinguish Cleopatra from other queens of Egypt is that on her brow she has not one but 3 snakes. And by using these 3 snakes, we can identify pieces as Cleopatra which are otherwise unnamed. And finally, we have this image, which I'm going to leave you with. Recovered in Rome, it's the goddess Isis, but it's been suggested that this actually might be the face of Cleopatra taking the role of the goddess Isis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That was really, really interesting. I love a good Cleopatra story. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions for Professor Joyce Tyldesley on Cleopatra, then please do type them out in the chat. Either send the message directly to me or send the message to everyone, and then we should be able to see it. In the meantime, do you mind if I ask a question while we wait?
Go ahead.
The extent to which the reception of Cleopatra by European scholars in the Renaissance, how much do you think that was influenced by the Roman writers as opposed to the Arabic scholars?
Very much, because they didn't have access to the writings of the Arabic scholars. It's only fairly recently that they've been published. But what they did have was access to the writings of the Romans, and these influenced people. And the fact that sounds a bit silly, but the fact that Cleopatra was associated with a snake got her slightly confused in the public mind, first of all, with Eve from the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve and the snake. And also, the story got slightly twisted. So she became seen as a good woman who died for the love of men. And she was promoted by Geoffrey Chaucer in this way. So her story started to change slightly in the Western tradition. And then when Shakespeare came to write about Cleopatra, he used Plutarch as the basis of his Cleopatra. And pretty much every Cleopatra after that has been based to some extent on the Shakespeare-Plutarch version of Cleopatra. So we see her as a very different person, as I think, than the Egyptians would have seen her, who would have seen her as a strong queen who took over Egypt, because her father had left the land almost bankrupt, and she managed to turn things around. She managed to acquire an empire. I mean, there wasn't enough time to talk about everything that she did, but she was a really good ruler. Or again, different to how the Islamic writers would have seen her, they would have seen her as a wise woman, someone who was a scientist and a builder and so on. So we have these very different versions of Cleopatra. It's a really interesting subject, the development of her myth.
Absolutely. So we have a question here. What were the sources for the Arabic writers on Cleopatra? Do we know that?
No, I mean, we're getting them from scraps of information that's come from the remainder of the libraries, because unfortunately a lot of the libraries were burnt. But what we have in the libraries seem to be based on what's come from that. But obviously, again, not eyewitnesses at all.
Quite. I think we have time for one last question. What happened to Cleopatra and Antony's children?
Well, she had 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter, well, all three of those 3 children. Caesarion was killed soon after Cleopatra committed suicide. The 3 children by Antony were sent to Rome and were brought up by Mark Antony's wife, Octavia, who was the sister of Octavian. The daughter survived and actually got married to Juba and went off to become a queen in her own right, and had a son called Ptolemy, who was then murdered by Caligula. But the 2 boys disappear, and we don't actually know what happened to them. We assume that they didn't survive childhood in Rome, but we don't really know.
That's really fascinating. So there was because the daughter was called Cleopatra as well, wasn't she?
Yes.
Cleopatra Selene.
Yes.
So there was another Cleopatra after the famous Cleopatra who was queen, just not of Egypt.